My name is Daniel. I am 61 years old, and I have killed 252 men. Not in war, not in madness, in silence. The kind of silence that builds inside a man over decades, layer by layer, until it becomes something heavier than iron and sharper than any blade ever forged in the American South. I did what no court would do, what no law would permit, what no God seemed willing to act upon. I became the consequence, the price, the reckoning that 252 men never saw coming, because they never once looked me in the eye long enough to see what was living behind them. They saw a body. They never saw the war. But before I tell you how it ended, before I tell you about the last man, about Detective Fairchild, about the night in Virginia when everything I'd built over 30 years nearly collapsed, I need you to understand something. I did not wake up one morning and choose this path. This path chose me. It was carved into my back before I was old enough to understand what a scar meant. And if you think you already know where this story goes, you are wrong. Dead wrong.
If this story is already stirring something inside you, something you can't quite name, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me where you're from. Your support keeps these stories alive. It puts food on my family's table. And trust me, what comes next will shake you to your bones.
The first plantation I remember smelled like wet earth and burning pine. Natchez, Mississippi. The air there sat heavy on your chest like a boot. Humid, thick, alive with the sound of insects that never seemed to sleep. The cabins we lived in were built from split logs and river mud. And at night, the wind came through the gaps in the walls like it was searching for something it had lost. I can still feel the rough grain of that dirt floor beneath my bare feet in the early morning, before the bell rang and the day became a thing to survive rather than live. The sky over Natchez was enormous, the kind of sky that made a man feel small and forgotten, which, I suppose, was exactly the point. My days were measured in cotton rows and tobacco leaves. Up before dawn, back after dark, hands bleeding by midweek, body moving on something that wasn't quite energy anymore, something closer to obligation, to the rhythm of survival. I learned early that if you worked fast enough, the overseer's eye moved on to someone else. So I worked fast. I worked quietly. I watched. I watched the way the foreman walked his rounds. Always the same path, always the same timing. I watched which dogs were chained at night and which ran loose. I watched the gaps in the fence line where the wood had rotted through. I told myself I was just observing. But the truth is, even then, some part of me was already planning, already waiting. The wound I carried wasn't just my own. It had a name. My mother's name. Sarah. She was sold on a Tuesday morning in October. The kind of morning where the light comes in gold and soft and makes the world look like it could be gentle. She was sold while I was in the field. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. By noon, the space where she had existed in my life was simply empty, like a tooth pulled from a jaw. I was 14 years old. I stood at the edge of that field that evening, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not broken, not crying, still. The kind of still that doesn't come from peace. The kind that comes when a man decides quietly and completely that he has nothing left to lose. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because the preacher had come the Sunday before and told us God was watching over us. 4 days later, I decided God needed help. The overseer's name was Calhoun. Red-faced, thick-necked, a man who wore his cruelty the way other men wore a Sunday coat. He had taken a boy named Thomas, no older than 16, and beaten him in front of all of us for dropping a basket of cotton. Not a small beating, the kind that changes the shape of a person. Thomas never walked straight again. I stood in that line, hands at my sides, eyes forward, and I felt the stillness inside me shift, slowly, like a river changing course after a flood. That evening I made my first promise, not to God, to myself. Calhoun would be the first. The choice I faced wasn't simple. It never is when you strip it down to its bones. I could endure. I could keep my head low, work my rows, survive. That was a sensible thing. The thing that kept a man breathing. Or I could act and risk everything. Not just my life, but the lives of every soul in those cabins who might be blamed for what I did. I lay on my back that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of a dozen men around me, and I asked myself one question. What kind of man do you want to die as? The answer came not in words, but in the image of my mother's empty space, of Thomas walking crooked, of 200 years of silence that had never once been answered. I chose to act. God forgive me, or don't. Either way, I'd made my decision. Calhoun fell from the cellar roof on a Friday morning, 11 days later. Everyone said the old wood gave way beneath him. Maybe it did. I'd spent 3 nights loosening the boards with a rusted nail I kept hidden in the sole of my shoe. The fall broke his leg in 2 places and cracked 3 ribs. He didn't die, not that time. But he never came back to that plantation. They carried him away on a cart, groaning, his red face pale as ash. I watched from the field. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something quieter, colder. The recognition that I was capable of this, that the line I had been afraid to cross was already behind me, and the road ahead was very, very long. The first real opposition came in the form of a man named Silas, another enslaved man, older than me, who had watched what I did with Calhoun more carefully than I realized. He found me alone by the water trough one evening, his voice barely above a breath. "I know what you did, boy," he said. "And I know what you're planning to do next." My blood went cold, not because I feared Silas, but because I feared what fear could make Silas do. A man who talks to the overseer to protect himself isn't a coward. He's just a man trying to survive. I looked at him for a long moment, the evening insects screaming around us, the last light dying on the horizon. "Then you know," I said quietly, "that you'd be safer pretending you saw nothing." He searched my face, Then he walked away. He never said another word. But I never slept deeply again after that night, alone, in those hours before dawn when the plantation finally went quiet. I would lie still and let the thoughts come, the ones I kept buried during daylight. I thought about my mother. I wondered if she was still alive, if some other set of hands had claimed her, if she ever thought about the boy she left behind in that cotton field. I thought about Thomas and his crooked walk. I thought about the faces of the men I was watching, studying, the ones whose routines I'd already memorized, whose weaknesses I'd already cataloged. And I thought about God. I had not stopped believing in him, but I had stopped waiting for him. If he existed, I reasoned, then he had given me these hands, this mind, this patience for a reason. I was not acting against his will. I was simply doing the work he had left unfinished. The second obstacle arrived when I was sold, not as punishment, but as profit. Marcus Whitfield needed cash, and I was his most valuable asset. Ironic, that word, asset. I was loaded onto a cart and chains on a gray morning in February, alongside 4 others, and driven north toward a plantation outside Vicksburg. I'd spent 8 months learning Natchez, its rhythms, its weaknesses, its people. Now I had to start over. Another property, another overseer to study, another 90 days of invisibility. What broke me, briefly, was not the chains or the cold or the hunger on that journey. It was passing through a town and seeing, in a shop window, a set of silver candlesticks that probably cost more than my entire life had been valued at auction. Something burned through me then, not anger, something older, something with no name in English. Vicksburg was worse than Natchez in ways I hadn't thought possible. The overseer there, a man named Garrett, Benjamin Garrett, was not loud or explosive like Calhoun. He was methodical, quiet, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. He kept a leather ledger where he recorded every infraction, every worker, every punishment administered. He ran that plantation like a machine, and he understood that fear, applied consistently and coldly, was more effective than rage. The county sheriff visited twice a month. The patrols ran 7 nights a week. 3 dogs, unchained, roamed the property after dark. I had walked into the most controlled environment I had ever encountered. And for the first time since Natchez, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed. Genuine uncertainty. I did not know if I could win here. The night I came closest to breaking was a Wednesday in August. Garrett had selected a woman named Ruth for punishment. I never learned what she had supposedly done. I stood in that line, as I always did, eyes forward, hands still, the mask of submission pulled tight across my face. But inside, something was tearing. I had trained myself to feel the anger as fuel, cold, controlled, useful. That night, it was neither cold nor controlled. It was fire, raw and consuming. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm until I felt blood, just to have something physical to focus on, just to keep my face still. Afterward, Alone in the dark, I wept, silently, the way men weep when they have learned that sound is dangerous. And when I was done, I wiped my face, stared at the ceiling, and began planning Benjamin Garrett's death with a clarity that frightened even me. The revelation came not in a moment of violence, but in a moment of stillness. Garrett kept his ledger locked in a tin box beneath his desk. I had seen it 100 times, carried in and out under his arm like something sacred. One morning, sent to clean his office while he rode the property lines, I found the box unlocked. A careless mistake, the first I'd ever seen him make. I opened it. Inside the ledger were not just names and punishments. There were dates, locations, transfer records. And there, written in Garrett's careful mechanical hand, were the names of 17 plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Virginia. All connected, all exchanging workers, all coordinating sales to prevent exactly what I had been doing. Moving men like me before we could become dangerous. They had known, not about me specifically, but they had known that men like me existed, and they had built a system specifically designed to stop us. Everything rearranged itself in my mind like furniture after an earthquake. Every sale, every transfer, every chain and cart ride I had endured across 3 states. It hadn't been random commerce. It had been a network, a deliberate, organized machinery of control that stretched far beyond any single plantation or any single man. Whitfield selling me to Garrett hadn't been about cash. It had been a warning passed between men who suspected something without being able to name it. And Detective Fairchild, whose name I'd first heard whispered in Vicksburg by a freedman who worked the docks, was not simply a lawman following a trail of dead overseers. He was the network's answer to me, their weapon against mine. I closed that ledger, replaced it exactly as I had found it, and walked back out into the August heat. I now understood the true scale of the war I was fighting, and I understood, for the first time, that I could lose it. The options I had were not really options at all. They were 2 different ways of dying. I could disappear, use a network of conductors and safe houses I had built over years, the whispered names and hidden roads that move people north like water finding cracks in stone. I could vanish into Canada, into anonymity, into a life where no one would ever find me. I would survive, but Garrett would keep his ledger. The network would keep running. Ruth would keep bleeding on Wednesday evenings. And every man I had not yet reached would continue paying the price of my survival with their bodies. The second option was to finish what I had started, to strike at the ledger itself, expose the network, and accept that Fairchild was close enough now that finishing meant I might not walk away. I sat with both options for 3 days. 3 days of cotton rows and bleeding hands, and that enormous Mississippi sky pressing down on me like a judgment. I chose to stay. And in choosing to stay, I finally understood who I truly was. Not a killer, not a monster, not the demon that Fairchild's reports described in careful bureaucratic language. I was a man who had been handed an unbearable weight and had chosen, every single morning for 30 years, to keep carrying it rather than set it down and save himself. There is no glory in that. I want to be honest with you about that. There was no moment of heroic clarity, no divine light, no voice from heaven confirming my righteousness. There was only the image of Ruth's face and Thomas's crooked walk and my mother's empty space in the world, and the quiet, devastating knowledge that if not me, then no one. The system had spent 2 centuries counting on good men to look away. I decided, one more time, that I would not. The night I moved against Garrett was the quietest night I can remember in all my years in the South. No wind, no insects, the kind of silence that feels manufactured, like the world itself is holding its breath. I had waited 4 months after finding that ledger. 4 months of perfect stillness, perfect submission, perfect invisibility. I had memorized every patrol rotation, neutralized every dog with scraps laced with the bitter root I had learned about from an old woman in Natchez who knew things that books never recorded. I moved through that darkness like I was made of it. Garrett's office door opened without a sound. I took the ledger first. That was always a priority. A ledger above everything. Then I sat across from Benjamin Garrett in the dark, and I waited for him to wake up. I needed him conscious. I needed him to understand exactly what was happening, and exactly why. That was the one thing I had always allowed myself. The truth, delivered in full, before the end. Garrett woke to find me sitting 3 feet from his face. The ledger open across my knees, a single candle burning between us. He was a man without fear. I had always respected that about him, the way you respect a dangerous animal. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, without reaching for anything, without calling out. Then he said, very quietly, "How long?" 30 years, I said. 22 men. He absorbed that the way he absorbed everything, in silence, filing it away. Then Fairchild's voice came from the doorway behind me. "Daniel, step away from the bed." I had known he was in the house. I had counted on it. I stood slowly, the ledger held against my chest, and I turned to face the detective who had spent 15 years hunting me through 3 states. He was older than I expected, tired around the eyes, and in his left hand, alongside his pistol, he was holding a document I recognized immediately. A writ of manumission, signed, dated, legal. He said, "It's over, and you're free." I have thought about that moment every day since. Fairchild never fully explained how he obtained that document, or who signed it, or what deals were made in rooms I'll never know about. He took the ledger. The network was investigated, quietly, the way powerful men investigate themselves, which is to say, incompletely. Garrett lived. I did not get the ending that justice deserved, but I got something I had stopped believing was possible somewhere around my 30th year in chains. I got to grow old. I got to watch from a distance as the cannons began firing in 1861, and the world finally, violently, caught up to the war I had been fighting alone for 3 decades. I am not a good man. I have never claimed to be. But I am a man who looked at an unbearable world and refused to simply endure it. If there is a God, I will answer for what I did. And when I do, I will bring the ledger with me, and I will place it open on his desk. Let him read every name, every date, every Wednesday evening, and then let him tell me I was wrong.